Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sunflower Club. Our guest today is Rainer Wylde. Rainer is an author, mentor, and podcast host at the intersection of creativity and personal transformation. He's also a good friend of mine, and we happen to share almost identical taste in music and literature. So, welcome, Rainer. How are you doing today?
Feeling good. I'm so excited to be here and yeah, mostly just to see your bright and shiny face.
Thank you. So I want to get right into it. And I love to start by learning about someone's origin story. So tell us a little bit about where and how you grew up and what were your first memories of writing and creating, and how did that relationship evolve over the years?
I love this question. I've actually been thinking a lot about it. I'm writing a book about creativity right now, and so I'm processing through that very question a lot. And my mother died a year ago now, and as we were going through her files, I found this picture of me at I think I was 5 years old, and I'm standing in the middle of a forest with 2 sticks held aloft like great samurai swords in some fashion, and I can remember this exact moment there out in the forest, swinging these, makeshift swords and throwing pine cone grenades at marauding bands of trolls, and um, I think so much of my childhood was spent storytelling in the wild. And it was natural that when it came time to learn how to write, that I would put these down. And there too, in my mother's files, were just infinite examples of creativity. I think my mother had believed more in my creative abilities than I did at the time. But I think they really fostered that I was a creative being, that I was a storyteller, that I was someone who was adept at that. I don't know if I ever believed that. I actually, when I was in 8th grade, I moved around a lot, and when I was in 8th grade, I took a placement test and received this surprising letter from the administration, and they said they wanted to put me in a program called Maximizing Potential English. And I read that, and I remember reading that summer and going, "Oh dear God, I'm in a special class. I'm like a remedial English." And I told my mother, I said, "I absolutely do not want to be in this class." And my mom was, much more sophisticated in her patience and perseverance. And she calls the school and says, "What kind of class is this that you're putting my kiddo in?" And they said, "Oh no, this is for gifted and highly intelligent children. You should be there." And I think I look at my life and I see, especially early on, that it is filled with people who were caretakers of my creative and prophetic imagination much more than I was, right? They saw something and they nurtured it, and they said, "Oh no, you're good at this. You should keep going." And I feel so grateful for that. I look at some of those early stories and I'm like, I don't know what they saw, but I am very thankful they saw something.
That's funny that you were put in the gifted program and you thought it was because you were the opposite of that. And there's something about that too, where being especially creatively gifted, it's like it's a fine line between genius and, I don't know, delusion maybe.
I think exactly. I mean, this particular class was very interesting. I'm sure they don't have anything like it today in schools, but there were almost no rules. There weren't assignments. There weren't dedicated projects. We literally were just invited to create, to read, to watch, to visualize, and simply to do. We had almost complete license to do this, and in that unrestrained environment where praise was often on the other side of whatever outcome we had produced, it really did foster this sense that, oh my gosh, anything is possible. It really lived up to its name, maximizing potential.
It's so fitting that your last name is Wild and your first experiences of creativity were creating stories in the wild. Where were these woods that you're speaking of?
I grew up kind of all over the United States. When I think of those forests, I think of the Pacific Northwest where my family ended up landing, but we bounced around a lot. My father was a televangelist and a minister, and was all very
Oh,
interesting. I like to say I grew up in the belly of the beast, which gave me a lot to rebel against much later. And that was wonderful. But those forests that I'm thinking of are in the Pacific Northwest, and so these giant sentinel redwoods that were there, and pine trees and the ferns, they each kind of took on these characteristics of some unseen but now visible world. I feel so grateful. I live now in the Southeast, and it has become its own character, the landscape. And I think I always look for the landscape to become a character, maybe because I was exposed to that so early.
I couldn't agree more. I feel like wherever I am in the world, there's a different energy that I'm drawing from.
Mhm.
Whether it's a ranch in Texas or, an island in the Caribbean or New York City, it's always like a different muse that's inhabiting that land. And when you tune into the actual place and location where you are, I find that your creation just becomes much more true. So being sensitive to the land and your environment is so important to sort of download clear inspiration.
Yeah, I'm one of those people, and so much of what I write about and talk about could amount to grow where you're planted. Like I am a believer that we have a number of very creative excuses why not to create, and circumstances is one of them, right? Like, if I was just in the right place. Actually, I was reading a collection of Charles Bukowski interviews, and in this one particular interview in the late '60s, somebody asks him about a Minneapolis, interesting, James, a Minneapolis poet who just relocated to Haight Ashbury at the time, to become more creative. And Bukowski, just unleashes a round of withering words. Like, what kind of creator, what kind of poet needs to leave one place to go to another? If he's any kind of poet, he should just stay on his front porch and look outside. And I kind of get it. I'm there. But I will tell you that one of the things I've experienced a lot through a lot of travel is exactly what you said. Different environments bring out different shades, different hues, different elements that you couldn't otherwise. After spending 30 years in the Pacific Northwest, I've got to tell you, I was remarkably bored with the backdrop of my own creativity, which is why I said, among other things, I need the sun, I need the Southeast. And the truth is that our environment matters. And I think that's one of the things I do want creators to know, right? Yes, grow where you're planted. Yes, we all find ourselves in adverse circumstances. And yet sometimes we have to change our environment, whether that's a relationship or a relationship to nature itself, in order to create the thing we wish. Both are important.
Yeah, totally. I definitely believe that you can create wherever you are, but definitely the aesthetic and the vibe of the work is going to take on different forms depending on where you are. I make the comparison to like painting. I think of two contrasting examples would be like Georgia O'Keeffe, who was like living in the desert in vast open nature, and that was reflected in her work.
Yeah.
And then you see an artist like Jean-Michel Basquiat in inner city New York in the 80s. And those environments couldn't be more different. And that's all in Basquiat's work as well. It's kind of frenetic, chaotic, scribbles, information, data. But they're both absolutely beautiful in their own way. They're just pulling from a different source that was sort of like native to their environment.
Yeah. And, environments are also interesting, and I encounter them. I'm a trained psychotherapist. And so, when your only tool is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. So, it's like, for me, I'm always like, well, what's the feel of the thing? What's the feel of the thing? And the closest thing I can say is that when I landed in southern Spain, I was hit with this heavy, drunken nostalgia, just sadness dripping from every portico, and I loved it. The creator in me is like, "Oh my God, I found home." And my wife lands there and she's like, she's also a therapist, and she goes, "Oh God, this is so sad." That is apparently not her creative environment.
To each their own. So when did you start becoming an appreciator and fan of art? So what were your early influences whether musical or in literature? Like, who are some of your favorite or first heroes?
Yeah. Well, so my childhood was interesting, perhaps, although I met a lot of people who have it because of the conservative upbringing I was in. Um, I did not watch television till I was 11, 12 years old. And beyond that, secular music, which counted for anything from, doo-wop in the 1950s all the way through, of course, grunge music and hip hop, was absolutely wrong. So by the time I discovered that in the early 90s, God, I made up for lost time. But what I had received was this beautiful immersion into literature. So a lot of my early loves were fantastical, whether it was the Chronicles of Narnia or the Lord of the Rings or any of these fantasy books that I think allowed me to escape someplace. And then, I think by the time I was in my early teens and we had relocated by that point to the Pacific Northwest, I was fortunate to be introduced in real time to the scene as a young kid, to the grunge movement. And I look back and I'm so thankful for that. I'm so thankful for the exposure of these bands who stood up and they admired authenticity over performance, shall we say. And I think that's a through line for a lot of my own creative work and something I saw visually over and over and over. They weren't terribly interested in the performative element. Again, like shoegaze rock, My Bloody Valentine, it's like they're doing nothing performative. They're literally just standing there staring at their shoes. And there was something captivating to me about bringing this. And my father hated this. He's like a big evangelist performer. Anytime we went into these new church environments, I would get up with big baggy cargo pants, jeans, and skater pants, and like a beer t-shirt. And it's like I'm literally putting out walls to repel anyone. You're gonna have to get through my authentic expression to get to the inner core of goodness of me. But I think I really was influenced by the grunge and post-grunge movements, and then I became a singer-songwriter. And that's kind of how I spent my 20s. So the late 1990s, early 2000s were given to that beautiful era where a songwriter could create something in his home, send it off to Grey's Anatomy, and it would become a big hit. And so I joined the ranks of those people as well.
Wow. Yeah. Rock and roll in the 90s was special. I actually relate to what you're saying. We were definitely Christian and we didn't play secular music in the house. It'd be Christian music or, maybe just like instrumental music. I mean, I think my dad I'd probably hear some Dylan and John Prine here and there. It would sneak in. And then when I was in my early teens, I had an older sister and she got one of those CD subscriptions in the mail. And one of them that she got was All Eyes on Me by Tupac.
Oh.
And when I got my hands on that, I never looked back.
Yeah, I mean, the role of older siblings, exactly. I had a brother and a sister who were a decade older than me, and, they had already left the house. They had already done their rebellion. So I would, get these kind of smuggled in contraband CDs, Enigma, Nine Inch Nails. Oh my God. I mean, I was like, when my brother puts on, Nine Inch Nails and I hear, I won't repeat the lyrics, but like when I closer, I'm like, oh my God, my soul is on fire. And there was something so liberating about that rebellion. One of the things I think, I'm a parent 4 times over, my kids are almost grown and out of the house, but one of the things I think about modern parenting, particularly of millennials and maybe even, Gen Xers, is we didn't want to recreate the childhoods that we had. So oftentimes there's this element, kind of a permissiveness, and we haven't really given our children anything to rebel against.
True.
And I really think there's something important about having things you can rebel against, right? Even arbitrarily. And I certainly was the beneficiary of that.
Well, now kids are rebelling by becoming Christian again. It's the whole trad movement. That's the new rebellion.
Oh my God. We have not raised our children in a religious sense, but occasionally they'll have friends who will invite them to go to some kind of convocation or religious gathering. And we always try to be, very supportive. We're like, oh, go experience, take notes. And secretly we're like, please don't join the cult. I'm just joking. But,
Yeah.
like, we're like, I don't want to be condemned.
I know my daughter's only 2, so I haven't faced that, but I'm thinking about what sort of spirituality to teach her. I mean, I suppose all of it. Like, there's a great like Buddhist temple in Austin. I think exposing her to a lot of different faiths and lineages is would be good for her. I'm gonna put you on the spot, and you can just like first one that comes to your mind. But I'm just curious, what is your all-time favorite album and book?
All-time favorite. Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy is my all-time favorite book. If you've never read it before, the one thing I will say is don't get it on Audible. No offense to Audible. It's just really such an interesting book that it doesn't really work audibly. I've recommended it to people who have done that, and they're always like, oh my God, how could you get through that? It is already difficult to get through. But Todd, there are some runs of sentences on that page. Like there is this one particular chapter, I can't remember what it is, but it starts with a sentence that goes for a page and a half.
Yeah.
And it becomes thunderous by the end of it. And you're like, he just broke every rule of writing, and I'm here for it. The
Gotcha.
way Cormac McCarthy masters language is so inspiring to me.
Good to know. I've heard so many good things about that book, and I think I do own it, but I haven't got the nerve to sit down and read it yet, but I definitely will.
I actually didn't read it early on. I had a friend recommend it to me at the height of 2020 when the sky turned dark in Portland, Oregon because of the fires, and there were riots in the street, and COVID is in the air, and God, the world was ending, and here I am reading this like kind of apocalyptic novel, and it just spoke to me when it needed to, and I was just so inspired by that. And I love Cormac McCarthy anyway.
It's funny because I read The Road during COVID as well, and that's another post-apocalyptic book of his. And I remember I started prepping after that book and then buying food and supplies because he painted such a bleak and dire picture.
That book, I love that book. I also really enjoyed the movie. I went to see that movie with a good friend we were young fathers at the time. And when the movie ended, I've never had an experience quite like it where we both spontaneously burst out in tears out of relief. We were just so kind of like we had been on edge the whole time, and particularly as fathers, but very powerful what he does with his storytelling technique. As far as album goes, God, James, you ask the hard questions. Okay. So I'm not going to give a great answer. Can I give not a great answer? Can I just give a very personal one?
Yeah,
Would
of
that
course.
be okay? Here's the deal. When I first listened in 1993, 94 to Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness by Smashing Pumpkins, I appreciated it a lot. And what I think when I listen to it today is I don't think there's been a more influential album on my thinking than that album. The existentialist themes that run through Corgan's poetry become song are inescapable. They're finely tuned to a teenage mind. I mean, believe in me, in the resolute urgency of now. I mean, God, I actually have a friend who sometimes will go through my writings on Instagram, and he's like, oh, you were just Easter egging Smashing Pumpkins lyrics, aren't you? I'm like, yes, that's what I do. That's what I do. I'm a evangelist for the Pumpkins.
That's a great answer. It's such an ambitious album too, to come out of like they weren't really grunge, but sort of the grunge scene, and then to create this like orchestral, sprawling double album. I mean, one of the most ambitious albums ever, and they nailed it.
I mean, it is incredible. I bought it on vinyl. I bought the deluxe edition, and I sometimes will put it on, much to my children's chagrin. My oldest son, it was his first concert I ever took him to. It was the Pumpkins. It was really good. They only played off a Siamese Dream and Melancholy, and it was incredible. My youngest son, on the other hand, God, within the first seconds of any Smashing Pumpkins song, he's like, Dad, turn it off right now. I hate this music. I'm like, what have I done?
A little divisive, but I do want to talk a little bit about your journey into psychology, and I guess what did you take away from that? How did that shape your creative practice, and I guess what did you learn about the relationship that people have with creativity?
Yeah, there are probably multiple threads that go into how I got into it. One of them was my father prepared me to become a pastor. And when I realized I didn't believe in God, that became, as such, that became very problematic to the idea of going into ministry. And so, I had to kind of utilize what he might call the gifts and the graces. And so, Freud declared over 100 years ago that psychotherapy would become the modern priesthood, and I don't think he was wrong, right? We still go to confession, don't we? And so
Yep.
I think there was a reason why it was natural for me to pursue that. I like to say I spent, over $100,000 trying to impress my father by getting that degree. He wasn't all that impressed, as it turns out. There was also something else that was going on. I was a part of an intentional community for about a decade that was dedicated to contemplative practice and mystic spirituality, whether Sufis or Zen or Christian contemplatives in my 20s. And when that community collapsed, I was so fascinated by something. What I was fascinated with was that some people had spent that, we had all had roughly the same experiences. We had seen it grow and develop and then end. Some of us, it had ended tragically for, some of us it ended well for, but we all kind of shared the same experience. Some people simply became bitter in the aftermath of it. They closed up, they shut down, they stopped opening their hearts, whether to love or relationships or spirituality or creativity or anything. And some people seemed to blossom and grow. And I was tremendously fascinated by, why does one person who has the same experience as another grow and the other person shut down? What's going on there? And so that question, I think, in some ways became a driver for me when I went back and pursued that. I ended up specializing in chronically suicidal and self-harming clients, where I spent most of my time. And there was a tremendous weight on that. What I actually saw was a number of people who were creatively stagnated, right? Their voice had been taken, their voice had been minimized or marginalized, and they didn't know how to use that voice any longer. And I began to see creative people over and over and over in that field. Eventually, when I left that field, it was natural to pull some of those experiences over. I'm always careful. I don't want to use jargon or even diagnostics, but I do notice patterns, right? The loss of creativity showing up in the weight we carry in our body, or stuckness or numbness. And I think, how I notice those patterns probably comes from that training. And I think that people probably mislabel a lot of the things they're experiencing as mental health disorders, when really we've been trying to adjust ourselves to a society that unfortunately is wired for inhospitality. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think that, like you said, the heaviness that people can carry, because I think that when you have a creative expression and outlet for that, it is a release where that have, because it's easy to get stuck energy,
Yeah.
and stuck emotions and just stagnation in general. And there are lots of ways to get that out of your system, whether it's exercise or therapy. And I think the creative process is one, because you're literally purging energy from your system.
Yeah.
And you're like, it's like spiritual and energetic hygiene. Every time you do, it doesn't matter what you're doing. It doesn't matter if you're making a masterpiece or just scribbling in your notebook, but there's an energetic release that happens that does, help to lighten the load that you are carrying.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the thing is that making things, whether that's what we might think of as art or meals or conversations or life, that is not a hobby. That is not a personality trait. That is not a special class of people who get to have that. It is a basic human need, as central as I think any other. And most of us have lost touch with that without ever noticing, I think. And again, I don't think it's a dramatic collapse for most of us. It simply is being educated out of those impulses. And unless we've been, really groomed and inspired along, mentored along, we don't come to those places. It just gets demoted to kind of like a side quest, till after we get the real work done of our day job. And I think that disconnection actually creates a rupture in the human soul, and we feel it. We name it a lot of things, whether that's a spiritual malaise or a mental health disorder, but I think it is actually something that is far more endemic to the human nature.
One of the ways that I've heard you describe creativity, or one of the, I guess, philosophies or approaches that you talk about, is this idea of slow creativity. And I'm just wondering what that means to you, and what is slow creativity and why is that helpful?
Well, I think slow is a measurement of indistinct time, shall I say. The founder of the slow movement, when he was talking about the relationship to food, he said it's not really about speed. It's about my responsiveness. It's about my ability to decide what speed I wish to go at. And I think we live in a tremendously fast-paced, hurried, hustle and grind world, always on, always going, right? And it demands one pace. Slow is simply advocating that I have access to multiple speeds and I am able to choose these things. So the idea is, I think, to some extent borrowed from Petrini and those others when I talk about slow. But I kind of, how I think of it is that we show up to life and the movements of life like a mighty river. And we allow those things to actually carry us along, right? So rather than rush through grief, I sit with it. I experience it. I marinate in that. I let the river flow over me and around me and under me and through me and eventually on beyond me. But I'm faithful to that process. Years ago, I was teaching a mindfulness class. And one of the clients, it was all on paying attention. It was all on being fully aware, fully conscious. This particular client, I just adored her so much, but I noticed she wasn't paying attention. She was just everywhere else. And so I actually called her out afterwards. I was like, "Hey, I noticed, that you weren't paying attention. Why weren't you being, available to this process?" And she said, "Oh, well, because mindfulness asks us to get out of our experience to some extent. And I wanted to be in it because I'm in love." And, I just loved that response to some extent. What she was actually showing, I think, to some extent, was that she was being responsive to where she was emotionally in life. And that's what I'm encouraging creatively and artistically. It's one ingredient. It's not about delaying, but it's fermenting. It's knowing that time is never wasted. It's the process. I think we finish before we look.
Mm.
And we don't let the dish actually cook. It's like pulling away from a tattoo when it's half done. When we can show up fully to our emotion, fully to a situation, fully to whether it's the heartache or the joy or whatever those things are, we find that our most creative edges appear. Yeah. It's truly being faithful and responsive to the moment.
Nature is never in a hurry, and yet everything is accomplished.
That's it.
And sometimes it does hurry, but it usually doesn't. It's sort of like it's responsive to the nature itself and what is required in that moment, and it's more adaptive, and it's not just like one thing, go 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 go, but honoring the process that you're in, like the water cycle. And there's a time to consume art and fill your own cup with inspiration, and there's a time to get it out and to let it purge out of you, and it's like an ongoing cycle that has to be renewed.
That's right. It's really not about pace in the literal sense. I don't think people should just work slowly for its own sake, although Cezanne said one must hurry slowly, and I've always loved that. But I think, what I'm inviting people into is to stay present to their life long enough for something to actually happen. The way clay, I think, resists being rushed if you've ever worked with it, or, even bread, right? God, I'm such a horrible bread maker. I tried my hand during COVID at this, and it was just miserable. And it was miserable because I just want to rush the ending too much, right? My wife can just let it sit through multiple rises,
Yeah.
but it won't happen if you don't give it time. speed doesn't just make the work worse. I think it actually changes what's even possible.
Yeah, it depends on who you are. Jack Kerouac certainly liked to go fast, but he was taking amphetamines at the time. And, again, you can create under all sorts of conditions. It's just going to look different. And it's like, what's the vibe you're going for?
Although I think Kerouac's a great example here because, while he nailed that first draft out, within a span of just sitting buckled down at his chair, it actually was a far longer period of time in which it had been fermenting in him, right? So that by the time he sat down, he was ready. And I think
No.
that's exactly how it worked.
100%. He lived the book before he wrote it, which took years. It's like you can't write if you have nothing to write about. Like you need to go and experience life and then something will happen. Like you might not be inspired and then something will happen in your life. And for something to happen, you sometimes have to go out there and make it happen or find something that's going to, get some movement and momentum. And then when something happens, then the creativity and the inspiration become automatic because you're responding to life. So living a full life is the best way to be a good artist.
That's it. I was invited by someone in Crete, a boutique hotel owner, to go there and to write a book. And, I had this glorious summer that I was gifted with right there on the Mediterranean.
Mm.
I arrive with my box of books that were going to be the research material and my notebooks. Oh my God, I was so prepared to sit there cloistered in Crete, pounding out my next book. And then about 3 days in, I realized this is a horrible idea. Like I should probably enjoy my time in Crete and have something to write about. And so I did just that. I had a glorious summer in Crete and find myself continually drawing on that pool of incredible things that happened to me, including a moment, which I think I'll share here, which was pretty life-changing. Because after a few days of not writing, I felt really bad. Like it didn't feel like relief when I gave myself that permission. And I remember lying back on my bed and kind of staring up at the ceiling fan. And the word that was rolling over in my head was frittering. You're frittering the day away. And I recognized immediately where that was from. I recognized that my father had burst into my room when I was maybe 8 or 9 years old before a Sunday morning service, and I wasn't changed. I wasn't ready. And he looks at me and he says, "You're just in here frittering." And I'm always someone who has kind of like a synesthesia with words. It's like all I can see is like a ball of dough boiling in its own juices and buttery fats. And like, that's just how I felt. Like I felt so gross. And I think somehow or another, I got it in my mind that if I wasn't constantly on, constantly doing, constantly going, that somehow or another I was quote unquote frittering.
Mm.
And lying there in that bed, I gave myself permission to break the rule that had been put into me so unconsciously so many years earlier. And it gifted me back a creative edge that I didn't have before.
Beautiful. More frittering then.
I say yes to frittering.
Yeah, you need the yin and the yang. You need periods of slow nothingness and then periods of activity. You did mention that your mother and father have both passed. And I'm just wondering, what you learned from grief, and did writing for you become a way for you to process that grief?
When my father died, it was unexpected. Like Hemingway said, it was gradual and then suddenly. And it arrived as such a lightning strike in my life. He died too early. And it was such a literal bereavement. I didn't know what to do with it. I actually, shortly after that, knew I needed to write. I knew that I needed to, but a lot of it just amounted to journaling. And I was very happy to do that. About 4 months later, I was sitting in Medellin, Colombia, and I was overhearing a couple who were arguing, and I was so enchanted by, his kind of mansplaining, talking down to her, and her, broken English responses, like chewing him out. And it was this delightful human experience that And I found myself jotting down their dialogue, and that emerged and became, within a span of about 2 weeks, a novel which I will never publish. I don't really think a novel that might never see the light of day beyond my partner who's read it. But for me, what it was a way of processing through that ending. It's not about death. It's actually about couples, beginnings and endings, but it is a way of talking about when you don't receive closure, when you don't receive, when the finality is something that you can't negotiate with, and processing that. Creativity became a way of pushing through despair. At the same time, I actually started a community around me, the Creators Collective, uh, in part because I knew I needed to be inspired and I knew I needed accountability. And so, how do I build that into my life so I can keep this momentum going? And then a year and a half later, my mother died, again, very unexpectedly. And that was a different death. One of the things I've learned about grief is as different as the people who pass.
Mm.
Uh, and so my grief for my father was very different than my grief for my mother. And also there too, I immediately kind of began to process that. I wrote a book of poetry, which also sits on a shelf. Uh, and, um, and yet within those things, I think that's even an important element, right? Not every creative work is for others. Not every creative work belongs in the hands of the world. Some of it is just for you, right? And not because it's not good or worthy, but because actually it marks a testament to the moment that is private. And so I think, in both cases, I learned that grief for me requires the creative expression. That's how I understand what's happening. Becomes more powerful, at least for me, than any kind of priestly confession or therapy appointment, right? That sitting down and seeing my own thoughts spread out on a page and following it all the way.
Yeah, I feel the same way. And I love that you don't have to publish something to make it valuable. Like, I totally agree. It's like I sometimes make the comparison to exercise. It's like I know a lot of people, including myself, that will go out for a jog, right? And you're not doing it to be on display, or and you're not training for the Olympics. You're doing it because it's good for you and it feels good to do it. So I think that writing can be the same thing. Sometimes it just feels good to do it and it's good for you and you enjoy it and it's necessary and you'll feel better afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, the earliest example of human art, the caves at Chavot, right? We're pretty reasonably assured that they weren't made for public display. You can't really fit more than 6 to 10 people in that cave at a time. So even if there were others who were there viewing the art that's on those walls, it was a very small group. They certainly weren't anticipating, that 30,000 years later that we would be, taking pictures and standing in awe of it. They were creating for some kind of deeper resonance, I suspect for a long time, right? That idea that they're creating for those who have already gone, for those who will come but never see this, for the animals, for the streams. I suspect that they were creating for the more than human world also, right? So when we think of, who this is for, at least visibly, I think we have a very limited range of view, right?
Yeah, they're probably just like also like, let me try this. Like
Yeah.
it's an experiment. There was no precursor. They're just like, oh, if I put this here, it does this, and then if I remember the shape of an animal, I can do that. And it's kind of like, whoa, I could. This is possible. It's sort of like you're discovering something in real time, and that's is why they're doing it. I imagine.
And I love that, and what you just hit on right there, I think is so much the heart of creativity, the making of the maker. Not that I made something, but there's something being made in me in the process. I was transformed in the making.
Beautiful. Okay, so final question from me. You've been a writer and a creator and a podcaster now for many years. So if there's someone who is at an earlier stage in their creative journey, like what is some advice that you would give them?
Create anyway. As I said early on, we have a world of creative excuses that sound like reasonable reasons why not to make. right? And we are haunted by stories that we imagine we invented, but actually were gifted to us by hands that were well-meaning, well-intentioned, and they themselves receive those stories. Stories like, perfectionism. Stories like, why even do this? Why bother? And we ourselves put ourselves through the ringer, right? We have all kinds of, as I said, creative excuses why not to make. I would say take the next imperfect step. Be astonished by this world. Put it into words, put it into drawings, put it into song. It does not have to be for public commodity. It does not have to be for some kind of very visible or visual effect. Simply take the next step. Channel all of your thought, all of your feeling, all of it into the thing you make. And making might not necessarily look like a painting or a song or a poem. Oftentimes, I think it is as simple as making a conversation, making a meal, um, building a life. Yeah, but you must take that next necessary step.
Listen, no matter how long the journey is, no matter where you're going, you get there one step at a time. And it's in those single steps that the journey actually happens, and you might end up going in a different direction than you planned. So it's like focusing on those single steps one by one. And, even if you want to do it for public consumption and be a published author, you get there one step at a time, not by like chasing some mirage at the end of the horizon, but by being there in the moment in the steps and seeing where they take you. And it might not be where you expect them to take you. And the journey is going to look different than you anticipate, but you'll arrive at a place that is true to you.
That's it. I love that. Yeah, I mean, it's just like having a good conversation. Hopefully, you don't have it all scripted out because that's boring. And you simply have to open up your mouth and say the thing that's pressing and relevant. And boy, do you end up in some interesting places if you let it.